He was aware of yoga. He had read about it. And he was a member of Self-Realization and Fellowship in Los Angeles. Are you familiar with that? Paramahansa Yogananda?
Are secrets that people take to their graves. And then there are secrets so devastating that they claw their way out even from deathbeds. In a Tennessee hospice room in November 2022, a man named Charlie Hodge was dying of pancreatic cancer when he called his nephew to his bedside and said something that changed everything we thought we knew about August 16, 1977. For 45 years, Charlie had carried words that Elvis Presley spoke to him in the final hour before his death. Words so shocking, so completely at odds with the official story, that Charlie made a decision that night to bury them forever. But cancer has a way of rearranging a man's priorities, and facing his own mortality, the weight of what he'd been carrying became unbearable. Charlie wasn't just another face in Elvis's entourage. He wasn't a hanger-on or a peripheral figure hoping to catch some reflected glory. He was Elvis's personal bodyguard during the final 3 years of his life, a role that required him to be within arm's reach of the most famous man in the world 24 hours a day. Charlie slept outside Elvis's bedroom door. He accompanied Elvis to every appointment, every recording session, every private moment when the king thought no one was watching. His job wasn't to look impressive or carry equipment. His job was to know everything that could potentially harm Elvis Presley, and to position himself between Elvis and that harm at all times. The relationship between them went deeper than professional obligation. Elvis had pulled Charlie from a dangerous situation in Memphis in 1974, a gambling debt that had turned violent, a life that was spiraling toward an ending Charlie couldn't escape on his own. Elvis didn't just pay off the debt. He gave Charlie purpose, family, a reason to wake up every morning that went beyond simple survival. In return, Charlie gave Elvis something rarer than loyalty: complete discretion. He signed non-disclosure agreements that were more comprehensive than most government security clearances. He accepted legal obligations that made speaking about Elvis's private life a federal crime. But more than that, he earned Elvis's trust through 3 years of proving that he would rather die than betray it. The financial incentives for his silence were substantial. Charlie's annual salary was more than most people earned in a decade, and his contract included provisions that would support his family for years after Elvis's death, provided he honored the confidentiality agreements. But those agreements became secondary to something deeper. Elvis had saved Charlie's life, and Charlie understood that his own life had meaning only as long as it served to protect Elvis's. It wasn't just employment, it was a form of spiritual debt that Charlie never expected to be released from. Which is why what happened on August 16, 1977, destroyed Charlie in ways that took him decades to understand. Because on that night, Charlie realized that all of his vigilance, all of his preparation, all of his positioning himself between Elvis and danger had been meaningless. The danger was already inside the house. The danger was wearing the faces of people Elvis trusted. And Charlie had been powerless to protect Elvis from the very people who employed him. The official story says Elvis was found dead in his Graceland bathroom by his girlfriend Ginger Alden around 2:30 in the afternoon. Charlie's account reveals that this version of events is not just incomplete, it's deliberately false. Charlie was the first person to encounter Elvis that day, not Ginger, not Dr. Nikopoulos, not anyone else in the house. Charlie was conducting his routine security sweep of Graceland's upstairs area around 2:00 a.m. and when he heard sounds coming from Elvis's private bathroom. Not sounds of distress, not sounds of medical crisis, but the unmistakable sound of conversation. Elvis was talking to someone. When Charlie investigated, he found Elvis sitting on the bathroom floor, fully conscious, completely lucid, and apparently waiting for him. This wasn't a man in the grip of a drug overdose. This wasn't a man suffering cardiac arrest. This was a man who had positioned himself in a place where he knew Charlie would find him during the security sweep, and who had something urgent to communicate. something that couldn't wait for morning, something that couldn't be said in any other location in the house where they might be overheard. Elvis looked at Charlie and spoke words that have haunted Charlie for 45 years. Not words of goodbye, not expressions of pain or confusion, but a direct, specific warning about what was about to happen. Elvis told Charlie that he had discovered something about the people closest to him, something about his medical care, about his medication, about decisions being made regarding his health without his knowledge or consent. He had figured out that the inner circle responsible for his well-being was actively undermining it, and he knew that speaking this truth to anyone else in the house would be dangerous for both him and Charlie. What Elvis said next was a warning, a prediction, and an accusation that would reframe everything about his death if the world ever heard it. But Charlie made a choice that night to protect Elvis's memory rather than expose his truth. A choice that has cost him every peaceful night's sleep for the rest of his life. A choice that he was finally ready to unmake as his own death approached. Because Elvis's final words weren't peaceful. They weren't resigned. They were a desperate attempt to ensure that at least one person would know what really happened when the official story was written. And they were specifically directed at Charlie not as a friend, not as an employee, but as the only witness to what was about to unfold. Charlie described that moment on the bathroom floor as the most lucid he had ever seen Elvis in the final months of his life. There was no slurring, no confusion, no signs of the pharmaceutical fog that had increasingly clouded Elvis's days and nights. His eyes were clear, his posture alert, and when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had figured out something terrible and was running out of time to act on it. The first words out of Elvis's mouth weren't a request for help or an expression of physical distress. They were an instruction delivered with the precision of someone who understood exactly what he needed to accomplish in the time he had left. More than 90% of the people watching this video right now still aren't subscribed, and that means most people are missing out on exclusive, untold stories about Elvis Presley you won't find anywhere else. If you don't want to miss the next revelation, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share this video with one friend. Now let's continue. Charlie, I need you to remember exactly what I'm about to tell you. Word for word. Can you do that for me? Elvis wasn't asking Charlie to call for medical assistance. He wasn't asking for medication or expressing concern about his physical condition. He was asking Charlie to become a witness to something that required perfect recollection. Charlie nodded, and Elvis continued with a calmness that Charlie later described as the most frightening thing about the entire encounter. This wasn't a man spiraling into medical crisis. This was a man preparing to deliver testimony he knew might be his last opportunity to speak truth about his own life. What Elvis said next shattered Charlie's understanding of everything that had been happening inside Graceland for the previous 2 years. Elvis told Charlie that he had discovered something about his medication, not that he was taking too much, not that he was addicted, but that his drug supply was being deliberately manipulated by people he trusted. He had found evidence that his prescription medications were being specifically combined and administered in ways designed not to treat his medical conditions, but to create and maintain dependency. The pharmaceutical cocktail he received daily wasn't medical care. It was chemical control. Elvis explained to Charlie that he had accidentally overheard a conversation 3 days earlier between Dr. Nicopolis and someone else, someone whose voice Elvis recognized but wouldn't name to Charlie, discussing what they called managing Elvis's condition. But they weren't talking about managing his health. They were talking about managing his cognitive capacity, his decision-making ability, his awareness of his own financial and legal situation. Elvis had realized that the people responsible for his medical care were deliberately keeping him in a state of controlled impairment because an alert, fully functional Elvis Presley would ask questions they couldn't answer. The conversation Elvis overheard included specific discussion about dosage timing, not to minimize his discomfort or treat his legitimate medical issues, but to ensure that he remained dependent on the very people who were controlling what he received. Elvis told Charlie that he had been attempting for months to reduce his medication intake, to clear his head enough to understand what was happening to his career, his finances, and his legal obligations. Every time he tried to assert control over his own medical care, he was told that his demands were symptoms of his addiction, signs that he needed more medical supervision rather than less. But Elvis had managed through 3 days of secretly reducing his intake without telling anyone to achieve enough mental clarity to understand the scope of what was being done to him. He told Charlie that his prescription drug dependency hadn't developed organically. It had been cultivated. The people closest to him weren't just enabling destructive behavior, they were creating it, maintaining it, and profiting from it. Elvis had figured out that he wasn't sick because he was addicted. He was addicted because keeping him sick served other people's interests. The most devastating part of Elvis's revelation was his explanation of why he couldn't simply fire his medical team or change his situation. He told Charlie that he had tried to dismiss Dr. Nikopoulos months earlier and discovered that he couldn't. His medical care was controlled by legal agreements he had signed during periods when he wasn't cognitively capable of understanding what he was agreeing to. Contracts signed while he was under the influence of the very medications that were keeping him impaired. He was trapped in a system where the people responsible for his recovery had legal authority to prevent him from seeking recovery elsewhere. Elvis looked directly at Charlie and said something that has haunted Charlie for 45 years. "They're not keeping me alive anymore, Charlie. They're keeping me profitable." And profitable means barely alive. Elvis explained that he had realized his inner circle had more financial incentive to maintain his dependency than to cure it. His erratic behavior, his inability to make consistent decisions, his need for constant medical supervision, these weren't unfortunate side effects of his condition. They were the desired outcomes of a system designed to keep him functional enough to perform, but impaired enough to control. Charlie asked Elvis why he was telling him this instead of calling the police or contacting his family members who might be able to intervene. Elvis's response revealed the full scope of his isolation. He told Charlie that everyone with the legal authority to change his situation was already part of the system that was maintaining it. His management, his medical team, his financial advisors, they were all operating under agreements that gave them control over his decisions while he remained incapacitated. And the longer they maintained his incapacitation, the longer those agreements remained in effect. Elvis told Charlie that if anything happened to him specifically, if he was found dead under circumstances that looked like accidental overdose, Charlie should know that it wasn't accidental. That the pharmaceutical combinations he was receiving were designed not just to control him, but potentially to eliminate him if he became too difficult to manage. Elvis had realized that the people controlling his medication had the power to increase dosages or change combinations in ways that could be fatal while appearing to be the result of his own drug-seeking behavior. The final thing Elvis said to Charlie was both a prediction and a plea. He told Charlie that the official story of his death, when it came, would blame him for his own destruction. It would describe him as a man who couldn't control his appetites, who died because of his own excesses, who was responsible for his own pharmaceutical demise. And Elvis asked Charlie to remember, always, that this version of events was a lie designed to protect the people who had killed him through systematic chemical control disguised as medical care. Charlie sat on that bathroom floor with Elvis for 20 more minutes, and during that time, he said Elvis was the most mentally present, emotionally clear, and intellectually sharp he had been in months. This wasn't a man dying of immediate medical crisis. This was a man dying of deliberate, calculated, institutionalized neglect. And he knew it. After Elvis finished telling Charlie what he'd discovered, Charlie's first instinct was to get Elvis out of that house immediately. take him to a different hospital, contact family members who weren't part of his inner circle, call the police, do something to break the system that was slowly killing him. But when Charlie suggested these options, Elvis's response revealed just how completely trapped he had become. He told Charlie that he had already tried to change doctors 6 months earlier and been informed that his medical care was contractually controlled by agreements he couldn't break without legal proceedings that would take months. Months he didn't have, because the people controlling his care could modify his treatment in ways that would incapacitate him long before any court could intervene. Elvis explained to Charlie that his attempts to assert control over his own medical decisions had been systematically blocked by a legal framework designed to prevent exactly that kind of autonomy. His contracts weren't just entertainment agreements, they were comprehensive life management documents that had transferred authority over his medical, financial, and personal decisions to other people. And because those agreements had been signed while he was under the influence of medications that impaired his judgment, challenging them required proving that he had been incapacitated at the time of signing. But the only medical evidence of that incapacitation was controlled by the same people who had created it. Charlie spent those 20 minutes trying to convince Elvis to fight anyway, to risk everything on the possibility that someone in authority would listen. Because while the entire world was focused on the Elvis question, while every camera and every conspiracy thread and every comment section was pointed in that direction, they were standing directly next to a different question. A quieter one. A more dangerous one. One that doesn't require you to believe Elvis faked his death. One that doesn't require you to believe anything supernatural or impossible at all. One that only requires you to look at the actual history of American music and ask a question that is far more grounded and somehow far more unsettling. What if the real connection wasn't to Elvis Presley at all? What if the voice that stopped millions of people in their tracks wasn't pointing back to the king of rock and roll, but to the man who nearly became the king? The man who shared that same Sun Records Dina, that same Southern fire, that same era-defining sound? The man who came from that same swampy stretch of the American South and left pieces of himself scattered? The prescriptions weren't incidental to the touring schedule. In a very real sense, they were what made the touring schedule possible. Uppers to get Elvis on stage, downers to bring him off it, painkillers to get him through the physical deterioration that the previous months of performance had caused. And then, more uppers, more downers, more painkillers. A cycle that compounded on itself month after month until the man at the center of it was barely recognizable as the person he had once been. And the people closest to Elvis watched it happen. The Memphis Mafia, the rotating crew of bodyguards, assistants, childhood friends, and hired loyalists who surrounded Elvis at all times, were not bystanders. Several of them, in sworn depositions taken years after Elvis's death, described scenes inside Graceland that were never captured in any official record, never submitted to any medical authority, and never came close to appearing in the sanitized story the public was handed. One former bodyguard described finding Elvis unresponsive on the floor of his bedroom on multiple separate occasions, not once, not twice, but repeatedly in the months before August 1977. Not unresponsive in a way that suggested a long-term cardiac condition. Unresponsive in a way that pointed directly at acute pharmaceutical crisis. None of it was reported. Not to a hospital, not to a health authority, not to anyone outside the walls of Graceland. Because reporting it would have meant stopping. And stopping was the one thing the machine around Elvis Presley could not afford. What makes this even more unbearable is what came next. After Elvis died, within weeks, in some accounts within days, members of the Graceland household staff began receiving documents to sign. Confidentiality agreements, structured carefully enough to hold legal weight, quietly distributed before the estate had even been formally organized. Some signed without fully understanding what they were giving up. Some signed because they needed the financial security and had no leverage to refuse. And some, a handful, refused, walked away. and eventually, years later, began to talk. Their accounts, cross-referenced with the partial documentation that has since surfaced, paint a portrait of deliberate, coordinated concealment. Not the panicked cover-up of people acting in shock and grief. Something more organized than that. Something that suggested the people managing the aftermath of Elvis's death had thought carefully, in advance, about what the truth might cost them. But here's what nobody talks about. What those sealed files implicated went beyond Dr. Nick, beyond Colonel Parker, beyond the Memphis Mafia and the NDAs and the Vegas machine. They pointed toward a third name, someone far closer to Elvis than any of them. Someone the public has defended, celebrated, and mourned. Someone who, if the documents are to be believed, knew exactly what was happening inside Graceland. And said nothing. There is a particular kind of silence that descends when powerful people decide that the truth is too inconvenient to survive. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It works through paperwork and legal classification and the quiet reassignment of documents from one category to another, from evidence to privacy, from public record to sealed file, from inconvenient fact to comfortable story. And in the case of Elvis Presley's autopsy, that silence was constructed with extraordinary precision. What the public received in August 1977 was a cause of death: cardiac arrhythmia, 2 words that explained everything and revealed nothing. What the public did not receive, what was carefully withheld, reclassified, and eventually sealed behind layers of legal protection, details of his financial situation at the time of his death are staggering when you actually sit with them. Years of compulsive spending, mismanaged contracts, a personal entourage that cost a fortune to maintain, and a business relationship with Colonel Tom Parker that had systematically stripped him of the kind of long-term wealth his career should have guaranteed. All of it had left the estate in a genuinely precarious position. The property itself was valuable, but it was also expensive. Graceland cost money to run, money to staff, money to maintain, and with no Elvis Presley generating income, the mathematics of keeping it in the family were deeply uncomfortable. That financial pressure didn't announce itself immediately in 1977, but it built steadily over the years that followed, and by the early 1980s it had become impossible to ignore. But before any of that could be addressed, there was the matter of where Elvis was going to spend eternity. He was originally buried at Forest Hill Cemetery, a few miles from Graceland alongside his mother Gladys. That lasted exactly 2 months. In late August of 1977. Now here is where the sealed records re-enter the picture. Because what independent researchers and investigative journalists have established over the years is that the sealed portions of Elvis's medical documentation reportedly contain more than just test results. They contain physician communications, internal memos, prescription justifications that were written in the language of medical necessity, but that, read against the backdrop of what we now know, paint a very different picture of what was actually happening. These documents were deemed too sensitive for public release. That phrase, too sensitive, is doing an enormous amount of work in this story. Sensitive to the truth, perhaps. Sensitive to the reputations of people still living. Sensitive to an estate that had every financial incentive to ensure the legacy of Elvis Presley remained untouched by the full weight of what his final years actually looked like. And then there is Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, a man who had buried his wife years before and was now burying his only son. By every account, Vernon was devastated in ways that language cannot fully contain. But what has been documented, quietly, carefully, by people who were present in those weeks after Elvis's death, is that Vernon reportedly pushed for the investigation to be closed quickly, to be resolved, to be finalized and sealed away before the public had time to form its own conclusions. A grieving father wanting to protect his son's memory is an entirely human impulse. Nobody would deny him that. But a grieving father actively influencing the pace and scope of a death investigation is something else entirely. And the question it raises, who else was Vernon protecting and from what, is one that the sealed records may still hold the answer to. Because somewhere inside those restricted files, the full chemical story of Elvis Presley's final hours is still sitting. And the people who control access to it have never once offered a satisfying explanation for why the rest of us aren't allowed to read it. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't get celebrated. It doesn't come with applause or recognition or the comfort of knowing that history will vindicate you quickly. It comes with professional isolation, public dismissal, and the slow erosion of everything you built your career on. And in the years following Elvis Presley's death, a small number of people with medical credentials, investigative experience, and nothing personal to gain chose that kind of courage. They looked at the official record, compared it against the evidence they had examined with their own hands, and said clearly on the record, at personal cost, that the story the public had been given was not the complete truth. They were ignored. And that ignored testimony is some of the most important evidence in this entire story. When the Presley family commissioned their own independent pathological review in the aftermath of Elvis's death, 2 physicians were brought in to examine the findings separately from the official coroner's process. And among them, codeine was present at a level reportedly 14 times higher than what is considered the upper boundary of therapeutic dosage. 14 times. That is not a number that coexists quietly with a natural heart arrhythmia ruling. That is a number that demands its own conversation entirely. But here is where the story moves from shocking to something darker. This was not the first time the medical establishment had taken a hard look at George Nicopolis. In 1980, less than 3 years after Elvis's death, he had faced a formal investigation into his prescribing practices, an investigation that shocked the medical community, not because it happened, but because of how it ended. He was cleared. Cleared despite the prescription records. Cleared despite the testimony. Cleared in a decision that left many of the physicians who reviewed the evidence openly questioning how the outcome had been reached. But 2003 was different. By then, the legal landscape had shifted. Additional records had surfaced. And in the deposition testimony that accompanied his license revocation, Dr. Nick admitted, for the first time on the record, in language that carried full legal weight, that his prescribing practices with Elvis Presley had been excessive. Excessive. One word. But in a medical legal context, that word is a confession with consequences. And it cracked the wall in a way that nothing before it had managed to do. Around the same time, something else was happening. For the millions of people who have spent 45 years believing that Elvis died because he couldn't overcome his personal demons, Charlie's revelation requires a fundamental reframing of everything they thought they understood. Elvis didn't die because he was too weak to fight his addictions. He died because the people trusted to help him fight those addictions had financial incentive to ensure he lost that fight. The official narrative that blamed Elvis for his own destruction wasn't just wrong, it was a deliberate lie designed to protect the people who had systematically destroyed him. This recontextualization has implications that extend far beyond Elvis's individual tragedy. It reveals how celebrity death can become profitable for institutions that position themselves to inherit control over that celebrity's legacy. When we examine similar cases other entertainers who died young under, circumstances that enrich their handlers while eliminating their own, agency patterns emerge that suggest Elvis's death wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader industry practice of treating celebrity as an extractable resource rather than human life requiring protection. Charlie's decision to finally break his 45-year silence represents more than one man's deathbed confession. It represents a moral reckoning with institutional power structures that continue to operate in the entertainment industry today. When Charlie describes the legal machinery that surrounded Elvis's death, he's providing a blueprint for how celebrity exploitation functions at the highest levels. The NDAs, the financial incentives, the medical control, The systematic isolation from family and independent advisors, these techniques didn't disappear when Elvis died. They were refined and institutionalized. Elvis's final words weren't a goodbye. They were an accusation. An accusation that took 45 years to reach the public, because the system that killed Elvis was powerful enough to silence even the witnesses to its crimes. But Charlie Hodge spent his final months ensuring that at least one person would know what really happened in that bathroom on August 16, 1977. And now the question isn't whether we believe Charlie's account. The question is what we're willing to do with the truth he died to preserve. If Charlie's revelation about Elvis's final words has shattered everything you thought you knew good, some truths are meant to shatter us. Subscribe now for more untold stories the entertainment industry doesn't want you to hear. Hit the bell, share your thoughts below, and tell someone who needs to know this story.